Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. Can organisations themselves be trustworthy? Or is trustworthiness only a quality of individuals? This question matters for how we think about public institutions, businesses and charities, and about the responsibilities they bear when people rely on them. Philosopher Matt Clark joins me to unpack what trustworthiness means, what kind of control and awareness an organisation would need in order to count as trustworthy, and why values matter in this context. Along the way, we discuss examples such as the Metropolitan Police and sketch what a genuinely trustworthy organisation might look like. Matt Clark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So we are here to talk about the question, can organisations be trustworthy? And that's something that you've spent quite a while thinking about and writing about. But I wanted to ask, first of all, why should we think this is an interesting question? Because I suppose some people might be thinking, well, obviously some organisations are trustworthy, some aren't. Like, what's interesting about that? Why is this something that's worth really thinking hard about?
I think that there's a variety of reasons to be interested in this. An important part of why I am interested in this as a question is that it does seem that there are things that it's inappropriate for us to trust, right? And we might think that the reason why it's inappropriate for us to trust certain things, so these might be things like inanimate objects, it seems weird to describe ourselves as trusting, is because they're not capable of being trustworthy or something like that. And so the trust can never be well placed. And so it's not the kind of thing that we should, it's not the kind of attitude we should have about these objects. And so there's an interesting question to ask there about whether, when we do sometimes talk about organizations being trustworthy or trusting organizations, whether we're actually kind of mistaken in the kind of conversations we're having, the kind of way that we might be thinking about this.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that there's been an increasing range of philosophical interest in how to deal with organizations that do bad things, right? Collective responsibility, these kind of questions. How can we be accountable? But there's been a lot less interest in how we can make organizations better and how we can think about them behaving well. Yeah. And so part of the interest of thinking about them being trustworthy is that it's kind of a starting point to think about one way in which an organization can behave well and start to think about the kind of features we might want those organizations to have, not just so we can tell them off when they do bad things, but we could maybe make them better things to have around in the world that we're in.
Good.
So,
that's great. So, I can see how that's an interesting question. So, one of the things you said there was inanimate objects aren't the kind of thing that we can trust or that can be trustworthy. But I suppose there's a really basic way in which they can, right? Like my laptop can be either trustworthy or not in the sense that it can work as expected or not, right? So I kind of trust it to not lose my work or whatever. But I take it you don't have that kind of really basic idea of trust in mind.
No, so there are people who do hold that kind of view. C.T. Nguyen, for example, has the view very definitely that you can trust inanimate objects. So it's not a consensus among people that you necessarily can't. Part of what I think makes that inappropriate is the specific view of trustworthiness that I have makes it quite important that you kind of can bring this feature in yourself, this trustworthy feature, about in a way that's sort of self-generated, if you like, and self-regulated. It doesn't require other people's intervention to make it happen. So I think that's part of why we value trust in the way that we do in the world, right? It's a way that we can navigate the world without having to constantly worry about how can I make this person behave in a better way? Or how can I make this person do the things that I want them to do? Right. And so for me, it requires this ability to kind of self-regulate yourself or to run yourself in some ways, which I think tends to be a feature that goes along with agency. And so agents tend to be the kind of things that are appropriate to trust. So agents being things like us, people who can act, and again, contentiously, but in my view, organizations and things like that.
Great. Okay, great. So, all right. So trustworthiness is the kind of thing that goes along with agency. It includes some kind of self-regulation. Yeah. So do you have a definition of trustworthiness? What's your idea of what trustworthiness is?
Good. Well, I've got a very long answer to this, probably, and a shorter answer. I'll try to give you a little mixture of the two. We'll see how that works. So in the other half of the sort of work that I've been doing, my doctoral thesis, I do a lot of work about the nature of trust and trustworthiness. And the overarching element of my view is that I think there are lots of different kinds of trustworthiness and trust. So I have this kind of pluralistic view of trustworthiness and trust. And how they relate to each other is that they help us to reduce ways that we're vulnerable to each other when we're interacting. And so things I call social vulnerabilities, but the kind of specific ways we're vulnerable to each other because we are two people who can interact. There's a broad range of these. For example, I think one of them is the fact that we have this sort of psychological or emotional need to feel attached or to belong to a group of people. And so one way of being trustworthy is to treat someone in an appropriate way that they belong. But that's very different, I think, to some of the other ways that we might be interested in trust and trustworthiness. And so kind of the way that we can focus and pick out specific forms of trust is to think about exactly how we're vulnerable to different kinds of agents and what's dominant in that relationship. And so I think when we think about organizations, as I tend to think of them, are quite practical objects, right? They do specific things and we turn to them because they do these specific things. And that makes us heavily reliant on those organizations. And what do I mean by reliant? Well, something along the lines of, in order for us to act in the ways that we want to act, they have to also behave or act in certain ways, right? And so when they fail to behave or act in those ways, we fail to achieve something that we've been aiming to do. So you can think of this in quite a basic way. An organization, a shop that you might go to, right? You're reliant on it having the good that you want to buy from it, having the object that you want in it. And if it has poor quality objects or if it has kind of the wrong kind of things, then you're going to fail to exercise your agency. You're going to fail to act in the way.
Right. Okay.
And so you're vulnerable in that specific way.
Okay.
And so the kind of trustworthiness I think we ought to be interested in for organizations is one that helps to make them more reliable, I guess, in a way, but it goes kind of just beyond basic reliability, which is something that I think is more general.
Okay.
Trustworthiness. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. So we're looking, right. So we're looking for some kind of idea of trustworthiness, which, so the kind of, I suppose the reason, maybe the primary reason why it's important to other people is going to be because it makes them reliable, right?
Yeah.
But we're not just equating trustworthiness with reliability, because then we're back in the realm of trustworthy laptops, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think kind of one of the major features of reliability is we can simply kind of design things to be reliable, right? We can operate them as if they're machines. And I think you can do that with people to a certain extent, right? When we set up systems of incentives and things like that to make sure that people behave in particular ways, I think we're more interested in trying to make those people reliable than we are in trying to make them trustworthy. Right?
Yeah.
And one of the features why trustworthiness might be more valuable to us than reliability is when that system collapses, when you can't impose those when you can't punish someone because you can't track them all the time and make sure what's going on, or if you can't have the money to give someone a reward every time they behave well. Absent those kind of systems, that reliability might collapse. Right? Whereas if someone has a trustworthy feature, it's not going to matter what the surrounding system is. In a lot of ways, they're going to keep this specific kind of behavior going. And so the way that I think that we should be interested in trustworthiness for making people more reliable is I'm particularly interested in the kind of most robust way of doing that. And by robustness, I kind of mean that someone will be reliable across time for a range of different agents and also in a range of different spheres of activity, different things that they could be doing. Right? And I develop an account of a way that we can offer our reliability to each other and that gives us obligations. So things that we have to do towards each other. Now, how might you offer reliability to each other? Well, I can do it me and you could be at a work party at some point. You might say that you're not sure how you're going to get home. And I can just say something to you along the lines of, well, I can give you a lift if you want to, right? And what I think I've done there is I've kind of given you a reason for acting in a particular way. And it's a reason that rests on me being reliable, me performing in line with that. And I think when I do that, I become obligated to you. Exactly what I think about that is a sort of tunnel down which we don't need to go. But like, yeah, it's what matters is these kind of offers. They can be explicit in that way. I also think they can be implicit. So an organizational example of this might be often businesses say something like, we're committed to this area, right? We're going to make sure that we stay here. That would be an explicit way of offering their reliability. But equally, doing something like building a new headquarters in a town or something like might be a way that you can implicitly kind of make an offer to people that you're going to be reliable, right? You're making these steps which seem to reasonably suggest that you're going to reliably stay in that town. And then if you then choose to sell that headquarters the next year, there are ways that you can do that which would make you untrustworthy.
Right, okay. Yeah. Maybe this is one of the avenues you don't want to go down, but I was wondering, are you thinking of trustworthiness and trust as being inherently moral or ethical concepts? So like, if we think about our relationship to organizations, there are ways in which they can sort of not be reliable, which wouldn't lead us to think that they were kind of failing in a moral obligation or something, right? So if the local Tesco doesn't always have cans of Coke or whatever, it's not, they don't have a kind of moral obligation to supply me with cans of Coke, but there are other ways in which actually failing to be trustworthy is to fail in a moral obligation.
Good. Yeah. So I don't think that trustworthiness and morality I wouldn't think of trustworthiness as being a set of moral obligations. These are kind of part of the tunnel down which I was saying it might take us too long to go down, is why I think that and what kind of obligations I therefore think they are. I think that they ought to align with the moral obligations you have. So we'll probably discuss this more later, but part of what I think you need to do in order to be trustworthy is to be very careful about how you signal how you're going to behave. If we take it that you always ought to do the things that you're morally obligated to do, then one of the things that you should be making sure that you're doing is signaling in line with the moral obligations that you have, right? And so they might overlap in those cases where you've kind of noticed that you have a moral obligation and you kind of make it clear that you plan to fulfill that obligation. Then you might gain a sort of trustworthiness obligation on top of your moral obligation, but they can also be much less than those moral obligations. And I do think it's possible for you to form them in ways that go against your moral obligations. So you might have immoral forms of trustworthiness. So I think things like the mafia are good examples of this. And I do think that there is a sense in which organized crime is a very trust-heavy area, right?
Yeah, no doubt.
But, at least from my understanding of it, from a non-direct understanding of it. But this sort of immoral trustworthiness, it is usually a kind of trustworthiness you shouldn't really be acting through on, but I do think you can be genuinely untrustworthy to someone by failing to act in an immoral way. If you're the lookout in a sort of crime and you don't knock the security guard on the head, you might have broken the trust of the people who were inside the bank vault clearing it out, right?
Yes, but it doesn't follow that you ought to have knocked the security guard on the head. Yeah, good. Okay, excellent. Okay, so I think we've got the kind of general picture of trustworthiness in place. So what qualities then does an organization need to have in order to be trustworthy?
Good. So there's two ways of kind of thinking about this, and I think the best way of thinking about it is kind of at two separate levels. Right? So as I've just said, what I'm interested in is how you can be kind of most robustly trustworthy, how you can do this over a large amount of people in a large amount of time and a large amount of actions. And doing that requires you to kind of be able to reasonably make these obligations related to being reliable, and then to make sure that you're kind of prioritizing them in the right kind of ways. And it also requires you to signal in appropriate ways what you are offering to be reliable to do and what you're not. And you have to be careful to make sure that those aren't clashing. If I've offered you a lift home from the work party and another colleague comes up to me and I know that they live in totally the opposite direction and that it would be impossible to do both, I shouldn't then make that offer of reliability because it's going to make it possible for me to fulfill the two of these. That's kind of the very developed version of it. That's what we're aiming for. But what I'm kind of interested in with groups is, well, we need to know if they're even capable of the basics that would be required to achieve that, right? And that might seem quite clear to people, but actually when you start poking around in what the abilities of groups are, it very quickly becomes very hard to defend their actual ability, that they have those things and it's not, for example, just that individuals within them can do certain things rather than the group itself. And so I kind of focus on three capabilities that I think we as agents would need, so that I think human beings need and generally have, and which allow us to get this higher level of trustworthiness that we're interested in. And those three abilities are that we need to have some awareness of kind of the external effects of our actions, so how our actions are going to impact other people and their situation. We need to be able to recognize and appropriately deliberate about these obligations from our reliability. And I should be clear there that I don't mean that people who are listening to this, who are probably like, never thought of an obligation related to my offer of reliability in my life. I don't mean that you have to think of them in exactly the kind of technical ways that I'm talking about, but I think we're quite used to being kind of, I did sort of make it out to my friend that I was going to behave like this, and so I probably should. And it's just those kind of thoughts that you need to be capable of having. And then also what I call a capacity to kind of control its behavior.
Right.
And those are the three kind of basic capacities that you need.
Okay, well, let's look at those in turn then, and maybe actually taking the last one first. So you said that an organization needs to have control in order to be trustworthiness. So what kind of control do you have in mind, and in what ways does control matter for trustworthiness?
Good. So for control, what I kind of mean is fairly simple. I mean, just the ability to kind of act in line with your intentions or the reasons that you might have. So for individual agents, this is usually quite simple, right? And quite standard. We can deliberate about what we want to do. We come to some decision about what we want to form an intention. I am going to say a specific thing. And then that happens. And kind of everything working correctly inside us, we have that level of control. That is more complicated in groups, which we get onto. And for why it matters for trustworthiness, it's necessary for you to fulfill those obligations that you have partially, right? An example that I use is you might offer to keep a secret for a friend. But if you, as an individual, sort of lack the ability to control which thoughts you say out loud, right? And you sometimes just find yourself speaking your thoughts aloud and saying things, well, you're not going to be able to keep that offer of keeping the secret. And so it's central to kind of competency, if you like. You need to be able to do the things that you're doing in order to be trustworthy. And to go back to the lift example that I was just using, it would be very bad for me to make those kind of offers because I can't drive. And so I should never make the offer to someone that I'm going to be the person who gives them a lift, right? Sure. And that would be an untrustworthy thing. But it would certainly be a non-trustworthy thing to do, and it may even be an untrustworthy thing to do. It also then comes on to be important in controlling the offers of reliability that you make, because also, and this is particularly true for organizations, as the number of people you're interacting with grows, it's going to matter how you're signaling to those people what you're going to do for them and how you're going to do things for them. And so if you lack control over your ability to do that, that's going to be really problematic for you.
Yes. I can see how that's complicated in the case of organizations, right? So the question of, to what extent organizations are under control and whose control they're under and who's forming the intentions and so on is not simple, is it? So do you think that organizations have the kind of control that we need for trustworthiness?
Yes, I do. But I do recognize, the whole question of collective or group agency, kind of the whole question of how groups can act, whether they can, whether actually all that's going on is lots of individuals acting in their own ways, and kind of whether we have anything above that is very contentious. I do think that they can. Part of the reason for this is I think there's just kind of a functional analogy. So there's ways that similar things are going on between individuals and collectives in such a way that I think we're right to say they have control. So if we think about ourselves, like I just said, we kind of can deliberate about what we want to do, and then some action comes about, which is kind of the inaction of that deliberation, if you like the outcome of that deliberation. And exactly the same kind of thing seems to go on in an organization, right? So we'll all be familiar with this. Any organization you've ever been part of, from like a local sports team to kind of your workplace, there are what are kind of decision-making processes that are going on in that. And these seem exactly the same as the kind of deliberation that goes on in our heads, right? The only difference is that they're realized in this different way. They're realized by people talking to each other or people passing orders between each other in a way that might feel quite different from how we think these things through in our own heads, but which serve exactly the same purpose. So you can think of voting procedures as serving these kind of functions, right? Equally, team meetings might do that. Hierarchical management, so just having sort of a person who tells you exactly what to do. It all amounts, I think, to deliberation. And then I also think that to fill in some of the gaps in that, another important part of what I call overall a decision-making structure is that we all have kind of role descriptions that we're used to as well, right? So those role descriptions we will all be familiar with. Your job description at work is a common version of that, but so are voluntary roles that you might take on. You might be the chair of a board or something like that. And how these matter is that they also help to partially determine kind of what actions you want to take, right? They help to settle practical issues of what you should be doing. But they will also dictate how you can interact with other people in the organization and how you take a part in those decision-making structures, right? Because you're in a particular role, you will have some ability to raise an issue that someone else might have, or you will be barred from raising an issue because you're not allowed to go to the kind of meetings where those issues are raised, or these kind of things. And so basically, I think this deliberation can happen. And then how that then leads to control is, well, I think there's a couple of ways organizations can do this. I have a broader story about why this is, but I do think that we face obligations to do what the decision-making structures of organizations tell us to do when we've kind of signed up for those decision-making structures, if you like. I think we often do this. I think some people push back on this quite a lot. I think a lot of people feel more alienated at work maybe than I do, but kind of, I think when you offer to take on a job, to a large extent, you are kind of agreeing to sign up for the various things that the organization says you're doing, and you gain at least a weak obligation to follow through on the things that the organization tells you to do. But then because organizations are complicated, and I think particularly because there are members who are more alienated from their roles, if you like, who don't view what they're doing as part of this, or who perhaps aren't really offering to go along with the decision-making structure, we can take advantage of personal reasons that those people have. Organizations can take advantage of the individual reasons that those people have to make them behave in the ways that they want to, and to kind of control the behavior that's coming out of them. And a common way we do that is incentivization. Again, you kind of go, do this, and then the member goes, I don't want to. And you go, well, then you'll be sacked. And we'll stop paying you the money that we pay you to do these things. That's one way that organizations very commonly gain control over people. They can use systems of, in voluntary organizations, it might be more likely that they use systems of pressure from other members to kind of go along, or kind of not tarnish the organization or something like that, right? But there are these various methods by which essentially control can be brought to bear from the organizational level on individuals. In a way that I do think, and I think this is important to point out, I do think that kind of individuals will still bear personal responsibility in these kind of situations. But I do think there's something going on at the group level, which is interesting, which if we miss, we're missing something important about how those actions have come about and exactly what those actions are. So kind of if you think about this in terms of someone doing their job, if you just describe that as the exact action that that person's taking personally, you miss what that action is actually part of. Right?
Yes.
So kind of just an individual trade in a bank of a share or something, right? As an individual action, that may be entirely unproblematic, or it may not seem like a bad move. If that's part of a collective decision to systematically trade these kind of shares in a way that artificially lowers the price of that share, well, that's problematic, right? But if we act like there's no group going on, if we act like there's nothing higher up, no organization that's got control over these things, we miss that action, just disappears from our picture of the world. And we're just left with all of these individuals.
Yeah.
Essentially, perhaps kind of collectively causing a problem, like we all cause climate change in some kind of way. But there does seem to be something bigger going on there. There seems to be some organization directing this in a way that makes it unique.
That sounds spot on. I suppose what you also want to avoid, and what I think your account does successfully avoid, is a kind of naive version of what it is for an organization to have control, which sort of says, well, the CEO is in charge, right? And they need to be able to control all the decisions that are being made in the organization. If they can do that and they're making the right decisions, then the organization is trustworthy. But of course, organizations aren't like that. Like, decision making is very distributed, at least in any organization over a certain size, right? There are going to be individual members of staff making decisions with a reasonable amount of autonomy. But what you want to do is kind of show how that decision making is still part of an organizational structure, and that there's a kind of network of obligations in play and things like that.
Good.
That still creates a form of control.
That's precisely it. I think, I mean, again, this might come up when we think about kind of signaling and things like this. Yeah, it's also part of my picture for precisely those reasons, that kind of what makes the organization might not exactly map the org chart that organization has, right? And also might not exactly map the legal structure that organization has. I think that legal structures are important, but they kind of are tags, they're labels that we put on things that already exist out in the world, and organizations can exist independently of them. And so, yeah, I certainly don't think that what organizational control would amount to is something as simple as kind of going, okay, well, they've got this really clear governance structure in place, and then we can just ignore what's actually happening in the organization, because officially on paper, these are the things that make up the organization. It's this specific structure. If there are, informal structures that have come about, they are just as much a part of the organization, in my view, as what's actually meant to be happening. Keep that drift.
That makes sense. Great. Okay. So that's control. So it sounds like you've got a pretty convincing picture there of what an organization needs to be like, I suppose, to have the right kind of control for trustworthiness. The second characteristic that I think you said organizations need to be trustworthy is to do with reasoning. So what kind of reasoning does someone have to be able to engage in to be trustworthy?
Good. So one of the things that you need to be able to do is you need to recognize these obligations of reliability as reasons, right? As things that you should act on. So just, you need to know that they're there, and you need to know they're the kind of thing that you ought to act on. An example of that is, I think one of the ways that we limit these offers of reliability, because they're quite easy to make, I think we often use kind of private spheres as ways of clearly showing that things aren't offers, general offers of reliability. Like when I'm doing something private, that's not something for you to kind of go like, oh, I know that person's doing that, and I can trust them. And I think that's one of the reasons, and I think anyone, I know when I've lived abroad, I've had experience of this, like when you move abroad, what counts as private or not can be quite different. Different cultures have kind of quite different attitudes to what might count as kind of something that you're doing publicly, or what would seem to be a private offer. And people, I do think, and there is some empirical evidence of this, like things that seem appropriate for trust vary between different cultures. And I think partially that's because kind of when part of the odd experience of moving abroad is that you're not recognizing these reasons that you've submitted. You don't realize when you've made an offer of reliability. And so you kind of surprised that it comes up and kind of someone turns up at your house or something and you had no idea that that was a thing that you'd suggested to them. It's not always kind of, it's also etiquette is often an element of this. I have a strong memory from like my first year of uni of vaguely talking to someone at some drinks on my undergrad who was from like a Nordic country. And I think I'd kind of done that very polite English thing of kind of, they said they were interested in something. And I was kind of like, oh, at some point, like, I'm sure I can show you that kind of thing. But in that way that I was kind of like, if we continue to have this conversation at some future point, that might be an actual offer. But I was just trying to be polite. And then they turned up at my hall bedroom the following day, demanding that they be taken to kind of, I think, the British Museum or something. And I was kind of like, oh, okay. Like, so you have to be aware of what the actual offers are and how you're doing this. And then it's not just enough. If all you can do is tell that you have something to act on, you then need to be able to respond to that appropriately. And what I kind of mean by that is you should look at this weight that they have and you should be able to appropriately weigh them against the other reasons. So work out how important they are for you as reasons. And you should be able to do that reliably over time. So as we were discussing, I think they're quite weighty. Generally, they should override other issues. So if you've offered a friend a lift and you're running a bit late for work and it would allow you to get to work on time if you didn't bother picking up your friend, I think you should generally not act on the fact that it would get you to work on time, right? You should ignore the fact that you're in that rush and it's more important to fulfill this obligation that you have to your friend. But they can be outweighed by moral considerations and things, as I've said. And I also think we need to think a little bit about how to prioritize them. I have a specific view on this, which is to do with that vulnerability that I talked about at the start. And kind of, I think when we're thinking about the range of offers of reliability that we have made or could make, we should partially be thinking about how vulnerable the other person is to it. So how badly will things go for them if I'm not reliable in some ways? And what will be relevant there is, do they have a whole host of other options? Kind of, is there a whole other range of ways that they can fulfill what they want to do?
Yes.
Without me having to be the person who does it. And then also kind of just how wrong would that thing go for them? And there's a couple of ways that could happen. There might be a more objective way things can go wrong for them, you know, kind of if someone's relying on you for life-saving medicine, that maybe is the kind of thing that you have to do. But if it's super important to that person, but maybe doesn't see kind of all things considered that important, but personally for them, it's the most important thing that they could be doing, then that is also something you should take into account. So you should have an idea of how much that plan is going to matter to that person. And so appropriately reasoning will be being able to kind of do these two things, appropriately kind of consider them against all the other reasons that you might have for doing different things. And then also to like weigh them up between themselves and make sure that you appropriately act on the ones where that person is actually kind of most vulnerable.
Okay, makes sense. And the next question is obvious. So can organizations do that? Can organizations reason in that kind of way?
Good. And here again, yes, I think so. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about deliberation and how our deliberation works, right? And I think we have these decision-making structures in organizations which work very similarly to how we deliberate about things. And these do allow organizations to reason. I think some of that can happen in the structure itself, if that makes sense. That may sound a little mysterious, but all I mean by that is think of a voting system. The aggregation of votes happens in the structure, if you like, right? It's something that doesn't really happen in a person. It's something that the group kind of does, is adding up all those votes and making a decision on the basis of that. So there are ways that can happen. But then the main way I think that group deliberation happens is the reasoning of its members constitutes the reasoning of the group when they reason in these kind of constrained ways. So what does that mean? Again, I think it's something we're all quite familiar with from work. Jobs will standardly tell you the set of things that you ought to be caring about for the decisions that are relevant to your role, right? And for the organization that you're part of. And what they do there is they kind of tell you to engage in a specific type of reasoning, really, right? They're saying kind of like, you might think this is very important, but actually for the purposes of what you're thinking about now, you have to consider this thing to be important. And we can engage in reasoning like that, both individually and with each other in kind of organizational interactions. And we realize that certain things are off the table in an organizational setting, right? Or certain things might need to be presented in certain ways to be put on the table. And so these things do, again, happen. You need the organization there to make sense of what's going on. This isn't just individual people doing limited kind of bits of reasoning. They only add up to reasoning when they're all happening together in the organization. And specifically with regard to trustworthiness and these kind of obligations, I think that there's certainly no reason to think that organizations can't reason appropriately about these kind of reasons. They seem to be able to adopt a large number of reasons. They can consider moral obligations, for example. I can't see why they couldn't consider these kind of obligations. Yeah. Partially that's because they're using, if you like, the hardware that they're using, the individual members that they have are capable of reasoning about these kind of obligations. So kind of combining them, I think there's a good reason to be sympathetic to the idea that we might be quite good at it. But I do recognize that there might be, some people might want to push back a little bit on that. But I think what they can do, and an important part of what an organization that wants to be trustworthy would need to do, is they would need to kind of explicitly say that they want to be trustworthy, that these kind of offers of reliability that they make matter and should be considered by their members. Right. So I think it's the best way for you to do it is likely to be for you to make a conscious kind of effort as an organization to do it.
Yes. Okay, good. So, it strikes me that there probably are lots of organizations where kind of considerations of obligations and trustworthiness and so on probably don't get much traction, actually. So is it a result of your account that really, in order to be trustworthy, organizations need to be encouraging those kinds of conversations among their employees?
Yes. So I would very much say that kind of the design principles that come out of this account are involve organizations recognizing the values that they want to have. And I do think that it's important that organizations think more fully about the trustworthiness that they could produce, and that they take steps to make sure that their members are aware of that and value those appropriately in their roles. Now, I do think sometimes there are ways that this can kind of slip in to organizational thinking. So I think often it slips in with a kind of reputational concern or some of these kind of things, because I think there is an awareness on organizations often that having said you're going to do something and then not doing the thing that you kind of made it clear you're going to do. And obviously I'm arguing for something a little bit more expansive than that, but I think there are ways that organizations are already used to having these kind of conversations. But to get that appropriate reasoning that I was talking about, you need to really kind of set the value that they have. And I do think organizations have the ability to do that, to pick their values to a certain extent. They can say the various things that they think are important or not, and they can embed that in the way that their members have to think.
Right, thank you. And then the final characteristic that you said organizations need to have is something to do with awareness of the external effects of their actions. So what do you mean by that? And, why should we think that organizations have that kind of awareness?
Good. Yeah. So awareness of external effects of your actions. All I mean by that is something that I think, again, many of us are very familiar with as individuals, right? We're aware that how we behave is going to impact people around us, and potentially even kind of people who are not kind of directly close to us, but who are within the society that we live in or something, right? You might be very well aware that if we choose to not regularly empty our bins, but that's going to have the impact on other people of attracting pests, right? Making the house very unhygienic to live in. And so all I really mean is having that kind of awareness. I call it sometimes kind of being aware that you're socially situated, being aware that you kind of exist in this social world, this web of interreliance that you have to act in. And it's important in part because it's, I think, important for working out when we are actually offering someone our reliability. So part of the mismatch that you might have when you're offering when you're talking about what you're going to do to someone else, kind of talking about your own actions to someone else, is if you don't realize the ways that they might be reliant on you, you might not realize what they're going to pick up on as an offer of reliability, right? If you don't understand the needs that they have, the ways that they might need other people to act, then you're not going to notice that they're going to take you to be making an offer of reliability. And you can end up, I think, actually making one in those situations. And then it's also important for that prioritization I was talking about. Because if you're not aware of what your actions are going to do and how they're going to impact on other people, then you're not going to be able to work out how vulnerable the different people are, and you're not going to be able to work out which of the obligations you ought to act on first. So the other part of it is to have a awareness of how your actions can impact others so that you can work out how you ought to be prioritizing those obligations of reliability that you have towards them.
Okay. Right. And yeah, do we think organizations have that kind of awareness?
Again, yes, I think we do. Now, I should point out that attention and awareness are like very heated philosophical areas of debate. And there's a lot of disagreement, particularly because a lot of psychological evidence has to be accommodated in terms of individual accounts. Good thing about groups is that you can ignore all the psychology, right? So,
yeah.
What I do is I again take this kind of functionalist approach. So I'm looking at kind of what function does being aware of things and paying attention serve for us, right? And I think awareness is heavily related to attention. So I start with kind of a definition of attention and think about when you're paying attention to something. So say that you want to, you start paying attention to the mug that you have on your desk. What does paying attention to that mug bring about in you? Well, I think one of the main things that it does is it allows you to gather information about that mug at a kind of higher rate, if you like, right? Part of what you're doing by paying attention to something is you kind of direct resources that you have, the perceptual resources, and you gather this information in a way that before you weren't really. So you'll notice that the mug is dirty, perhaps, or that the mug is chipped. All of these things will become clear to you. And that gives me a basic definition of attention as just an entity's ability to kind of direct its resources to gather information in that sense. Or also we can pay attention internally, right? We can pay attention to our thoughts and our deliberations. And there again, it's just about kind of how are we using the mental resources that we have? Where are we focusing them? What are we looking at? So that gives me my kind of basic picture of attention. It's just this ability to direct resources. And so what then is awareness? Well, awareness is, I think, just the ability that you have some internal mechanism that can lead you to pay attention, right? So why think that? Well, take the mug again, and you can imagine a situation if I come into your office and I go, oh, you've got a dirty mug there, and you genuinely have never you didn't notice that it was there at all. You couldn't have directed your attention to it until I pointed it out. It seems right to say that you weren't aware of that mug, right? And so this again gives me quite a basic definition of awareness, but awareness is just an entity having this internal mechanism that can lead it to pay attention. And so how can organizations do this? Well, again, it seems it's actually something organizations do quite often. And organizations, I think we should think about organizational attention maybe a little bit more than we do. But they do it through, most organizations will have systems in place that allow kind of frontline staff to flag issues up to management or something like that, right? That gives them a kind of awareness, because what it does is it's an internal mechanism that allows when a frontline worker says there's a problem here, the resource controllers within the organization can redirect the resources to pay more attention and gather further information about that thing that was flagged. And I think that serves exactly the same set of functions And so it deserves as much the name attention as kind of what goes on in our own heads. It's just, again, realized in this very different way because organizations are such different kinds of things to the things that we are. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. There's loads of things I wanted to ask you, but we're kind of running out of time. But I just wondered, maybe one closing question might be, if there are people listening to this who are members of organizations or employees of organizations themselves and are kind of thinking, what are the implications of this for what I should do? Like if I want my organization to be more trustworthy, could you say like a couple of things that they maybe should have in mind?
Yeah, I can. I think if you're a member of an organization and you're worried about its trustworthiness, the kind of things that you need to be concerned with are, first of all, being very realistic about what what the organization is competent to do, right? So we haven't had time to discuss this, but I do discuss the Metropolitan Police at one point in the kind of work that we're talking about. And part of what has happened at the Metropolitan Police is they faced an extended period, according to the Casey review, of kind of austerity that's cut their capabilities. Yeah. But they've kept the same level of messaging that they had when they were very well resourced back before that period of austerity, right? And so what you get is, talking about these offers of reliability and the obligations that come from, you get an organization taking on all of these kind of obligations to do with the reliability that it's offering people. Yeah. But they're not in any way able to do that anymore because there's a kind of fear of being honest about what you're capable of doing, or the organization seeming bad if it's realistic. But I think a major thing for many organizations will be that kind of realism, and then taking that approach when you're offering people. If you want people to be able to place well-placed trust in you, if you want to be trustworthy as an organization, then I think you should focus on, it's better to kind of promise less and deliver it than to say that you can give them the moon when that's not something that you can do. Another thing that I think is really important is that it needs to have that value embedded as firmly as it can in the organization. So kind of as we were saying before, this will often require the organization to kind of put that as a stated principle and to perhaps take some time to tell its members why that matters, how they should be thinking about this further. And I think also part of doing that, part of firmly embedding these intentions, is to think about the way that new members can come to change what the organization might want to do, or how over time you might be able to alter that commitment that you have. And I do argue at points for the idea that, for example, so I think the shareholders, at least shareholders with controlling kind of shares, are part of the members of these organizations. They have a role to play in doing this. And I think we should look more heavily at ownership regulation and structures of ownership that we have, and committing shareholders to principles that the organization might need as well, as just as much as we might want to commit employees. So you can think, I mean, an example might be, I don't know the full details of it well enough, but if you think about what's happened at X, since Twitter, now that it's become X, and the ability for owners kind of to shift the entire model that an organization goes through. But when that organization has offered kind of, to be the world's town square, to make these kind of very like bold kind of commitments to how it's going to be, while we have this gap where owners have the ability to shift the values that these organizations have, then you can end up in situations where you're going to break a lot of people's trust. You're going to end up being untrustworthy because you have these kind of changes. And these things I'm not saying something purely exotic. Some journalistic organizations, for example, Reuters, has kind of principles that for a long time were able to govern the number of shares in total someone could own and the kind of principles by which their owners had to act. So I'm not saying something insane. But so I think how you embed those and how we can think about structures of organizations to embed them better. And then I think the last thing that I would want to say is also just being very much more aware of their social situations. I think this can be particularly difficult for organizations. They can particularly large-scale organizations will be operating in lots of different environments. Particularly if they're international, they might be operating in environments where people have these very different expectations, reasonable expectations of them. And so controlling how you're offering your reliability is going to be very difficult. And if you get rid of systems that allow you to talk to individuals or allow lower scale individuals to flag problems to you, that's going to be really problematic for you. And again, I think the Met, according to the Casey review, the Metropolitan Police are a good example of this. The Metropolitan Police, Baroness Casey says, have kind of, in part in response to this lack of resources, they take an increasing kind of box-ticking view of their engagement with communities. Kind of, they've held the meeting, but nothing ever gets passed on. And the HQ has become particularly concerned with keeping these like national level abilities, the counter-terror units, these kind of things that kind of maybe give you a lot of kind of prestige, but less concerned with how you fight kind of the day-to-day crime that concerns most Londoners. And having that kind of disconnect where you've kind of stopped looking at how you're socially embedded and the people that you're serving in some way. And you've kind of taken on these organizational values that kind of, isn't it good to be part of this organization that has this kind of international reputation as a leading thing in this and that? They will tend to work against trustworthiness, I think, unless it happens that those are aligned. So another important thing for kind of members of organizations, for employees, all the way down to have to think about is kind of, I do think that we all should push our organizations a little bit more to kind of pay attention to, particularly if you're low scale, you know, to pay attention to the things that you're hearing people say to you. If you actually get to engage with the people who your organization is dealing with, you should say what those people think, because it will help the organization to have a better idea of that. And I guess the kind of final kind of slightly hopeful thing is that not a hopeful thing, actually, a very pessimistic thing. So I'll start
Okay.
again. A final, perhaps slightly pessimistic thing is I do think sometimes there's a philosopher, a very good philosopher on groups called Steph Collins, who's argued that we have these kind of moral duties to organize better, to make ourselves into collectives that can better fulfill kind of moral goals that we might have. And sometimes I think trustworthiness is a way to contribute towards that moral goal, right? There's wrongs that can be sufficient and trustworthiness can help us fix them. Collins is kind of the positive side of the view, I guess, this view that we should be organizing and doing these things. I think we might also sometimes have moral obligations to kind of unorganize ourselves, to eliminate organizations that just aren't trustworthy and rich. And so another thing to think about is particularly if you're in charge, I guess, of an organization that's struggling to be trustworthy or will struggle to be trustworthy in the future because of some changes that are coming to it, there may be times where the better thing to do is for you to just stop existing as an organization. You're going to let some people down, but the reason why I think that's so important is trustworthiness attracts trust. I don't think it guarantees it. I don't think you necessarily deserve someone's trust because you're trustworthy, but it at least attracts the trust. And if you continue to exist, but you know you're going to be untrustworthy, having been trustworthy particularly, you're going to drag those people who trust you with you, and you're going to let them down in a much worse way. You'll still let them down, but perhaps you won't let them down quite as badly. You won't be actively untrustworthy to them if you just say, we don't exist anymore, right? If you make it clear that you can't keep those commitments. And I think in some ways, signaling about that would be a good way for people to act and move. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a challenging thought as opposed to end on, but that's great. Lots of really interesting stuff to chew on there. So Matt Clark, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.